All right, so for anyone I've not yet had the pleasure of meeting, as Kevin's noted, my name is Pat. If for some reason you're looking for tweets that are rarely about code, my Twitter handle is also Pat. Or if you want blog posts that are sometimes about code, then the URL there, freelancinggods.com, is my blog. I do want to begin by acknowledging that I am on the unceded land of the Eastern Kulin Nations. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I live in Naarm, also known as Birrarunga, or more commonly, Melbourne. And it's home to the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples. I pay my respect to their elders past and present, and I thank them for their ongoing care of country, people, and culture. So Kevin asked me if I'd like to give a talk, and I said yes, before I'd even decided what to present on. And December is always a touch chaotic. So let's be honest, I'm a long way from prepared. I asked on Slack for some suggestions, and one person said, how about a talk about how people can nurture their careers as Ruby developers? And I think that's an excellent suggestion, but it requires some deeper thinking that I just haven't had time for. So maybe that'll be a topic for next year. I think it could work better possibly as a group discussion. But anyway, that's not my focus for tonight. So instead, I have 3 different code tidbits to talk through. I'm not sure if any of these topics would have deserved a talk all to themselves. So I'm just going to mash them all together in this talk, even though they're not entirely related. But we'll see how we go. So the first bit of code I have is focused on configuring Rails apps. I personally very much appreciate the 12-factor approach to apps, especially given that Heroku is where I often host my projects, and Heroku is built with 12-factor in mind. If you're not familiar with the 12-factor approach, here's a quick screenshot from 12factor.net. But I'm not going to go through that in detail because I'm really just wanting to focus on one of these rules, which is number 3, config, and particularly where we store application configuration in the environment, generally through environment variables. And if you're not familiar at all with environment variables, that's completely fine. Here's a few variable names that may be familiar. So environment variables and these types of configuration are often used for sensitive data. So that includes passwords and API keys, things that you generally don't want to commit to your source code. Or they could also be settings that differ per environment, Rails env being the chief example there. Although over the last few years, it's probably been longer, I don't know, time. Over the last few years, Rails has added in a different way to manage such variables, and that is by storing them in an encrypted file that is committed to your app's repo. And that's fine, I guess. To be honest, I haven't ever chosen this path myself because I'm so comfortable with environment variables. I have worked on apps which have taken this path, and I've certainly hit situations while doing so where it felt imperfect. That said, I didn't take notes at the time, and it's been a while, so I can't really give you some concrete examples of why I don't like the Rails approach. So I'm just going to have to go with a very Dennis Denuto, it's the vibe. But anyway, environment variables for me, that's what I prefer. It's definitely what I'm most comfortable with. And the way I've done it for a long time is just by referencing the environment variables directly. So that's using the env hash, although it's not a hash, it's an object that just looks like a hash. And I thought that was okay. But then I inherited a project from those good eggs at IceLab. And they have a habit of using a lot of the dry RB gems, including dry system. And I realized that I could take some of that and put it into a Rails app for this purpose. So now I have a new approach. So this is an example from one of my apps. It's in a initializer file. And you can see here that beyond the initial requiring and setting up, I specify each of my configuration settings and I give them a clear type. And if they are strict, then they default to being required. But you can say they're optional. You can give them different default values. Now, I could have other settings here that were floats or integers or booleans, and they could be automatically coerced accordingly from the string environment variable into a typed value. And then dry system will automatically kind of look at the environment variables themselves and bring them in as these variables. So then my code could go from something like this, where I'm using the env hash, to instead something like this, where I'm using those configuration variables and I know that they're going to be set if they needed to be, and they're going to be the correct types that I need them to be in, rather than constantly calling .2s or 2i or whatever. Not 2s, that's already a string. Anyway, the one catch is it does mean you need to use the dry system gem, and that has a few other dry RB gems as its own dependencies. But that includes dry types, which is a key part of having all the specific typed settings. So I'd say it's worth it. It's just a little different to what a lot of people are familiar with. Yeah, so that's the code there. I will share some links once I'm done with this code, so you can actually more easily cut and paste, should you so wish. I was just about to say, Ellie, did anyone have any questions? And I can see Ellie's asked in the chat, could I have just created a settings object rather than using the two gems? I could have. I would then have to have wrangled all the type stuff myself if I wanted the type stuff, and kind of validating whether things are set. So in this case, like if something's not set, I can't boot the app up, which kind of relates to the question Brendan's just asked. If the validation fails, yeah, the Rails app will fail to start because this is in an initializer, and it'll try and load the value and go, oh, it's not there. I can't do this unless there's a default there. But that is true. It is a good example for fetch, but that would also mean using or kind of pre-setting these values as part of the initializer, which as opposed to just using env.fetch wherever in your code, this catches that straight up. Yeah, you could certainly go down this down the fetch path though if you put it. Yeah, I know I only use string types, Adam. This was just the example I had, and I wasn't very prepared. Did anyone else have any questions? Thanks, Lark. Sorry. Michael asks, have I used an alternative called Anyway Config? I haven't, no. And I guess kind of this setup here, like I haven't bothered to put it into a gem because there's really not many lines beyond the settings lines. So the fact that I didn't need a gem for this purpose, granted I am adding dry system, so maybe that's not quite the argument I thought it was. yeah. I would be interested in hearing your points about Rails credentials, Michael, but I am also aware that I have a bit to get through and I'm probably going to run over time as it is. But maybe once we're through my talk and Ellie's talk, we can have that as general discussion later. Did anyone else have questions? I might keep rolling on, given I am a little concerned about how much time you're going to be stuck with my voice. Okay, so second piece of code I have to share. So this one is related to mocking out web requests and responses in my tests, particularly with JSON responses. Because it feels like pretty much every app I work on, or every library or gem, makes some kind of external calls out to the internet, usually to an API. And when I write my tests for these codes, I don't like those calls actually happening right there and then. I want to mock those requests out. And thankfully, there's a gem that does this for us. It's called WebMock. I've been using it for years. It works great. I really like it. And here's a very brief example of how it can be used. So in this case, I don't care about how it should respond. It defaults to a 200 status and an empty body, and that's great. So I can stub a request, and so any calls that make any code that makes a call out to that will get the stub response instead. And then I can invoke whatever code I need to, and then I can say, assert actually did that call happen. And these are extremely simple examples. I've lost my cursor. There we go. This one's a little more involved, but still relatively simple. But in this case, there's more of a URL there to match against. And I am responding with a JSON response. So I need to translate whatever my preferred body is into a JSON serialized string. And I need to specify the content type header. And that's good, but I deal with a lot of JSON APIs. And so I'm writing this kind of code a lot, and it didn't feel particularly dry. So what I've done, and this code is split up over a few slides, so it's readable, but again, I'll share it all in a single gist afterwards. What I've done is wrap some of WebMock's logic into my own classes and added extra helper methods there. So the stub request method, the a request method, they're part of WebMock, and I'm just wrapping their responses in my own classes, which are delegators. So they'll pass every method through unless I define something else on top. So this here is my wrapper for when you've stubbed a request. And I've added toReturn JSON, which is kind of like toReturn, but it automatically converts the body to a JSON string, and it also sets the content type header for you. I also have a with JSON body for the expectations if I wanted to customize to confirm the assertions around what I'm getting back from those requests. And I wrap all of that in a module, include it into RSpec. And then my spec can be a little more simple like this. So I specify that I'm returning a JSON, and I give the body as my Ruby objects, and it will get composed into a JSON string automatically. This is a once-off example. It's not that different, I know, but when you have a lot of tests, it does dry things up quite a bit. This is something that I've found I've needed in a bunch of places. And so maybe I should put it in a gem. I actually went searching on GitHub the other day while preparing, yesterday while preparing this talk. And I found similar implementations by other people. So clearly it's something that people need. So maybe I will create a gem for it because it's a little bit more involved than a few lines of code. Okay. Did anyone have any questions about this? Michael's already got one. Would you also do API integration testing when the API changes and your tests just pass? That's a good question. I mean, yeah, and Ellie's just chimed in with what I was thinking would be a solid option for an answer, which is using the gem VCR. So VCR kind of hooks into webmock, I think, and it lets the connections go out to the internet, and then it saves that request in a YAML file, and then later invocations of that same spec will use the saved request rather than talking out to the internet every single time. That does mean you need to be able to make the request at least once, though. And then if the API had changed, you could delete the saved responses, the cassettes, and re-record them from scratch. Tom's asking, have you ever stubbed a level higher and mock out something like a Spotify adapter instead of requests themselves? I find I either go the VCR route or the webmock approach, just because I don't want to get too tangled in my own implementation. I want to know that the requests actually work, ideally. But I guess if you had solid tests around the adapter, and then for everything else, you're just using the adapter, excuse me, the adapter, then that could work, yes. Any other questions? It's a good rule from Al to only mock what you own.
Have you done much with the Spotify API?
A very little. If you go to support.act.app, that's what this code is from, which, yeah, the concept of that site is to make suggestions from your streaming habits about albums you maybe want to buy, so musicians get a bit better support than the very small streaming amounts of money that they get. That's all I've done with the Spotify API. All right, I'll keep rolling because I'm still got a bit to go. All right. So last of my 3 topics is again around focusing around interacting with an API, but this one is a gem. So the API in question is for render.com, which is a hosting platform that's quite similar to Heroku. In some ways, it's a little bit simpler than Heroku, but it has other different approaches. I'm not going to get caught up in the pros and cons because that's a whole nother topic. But the big selling point for me is that Render runs on top of Google Cloud's Oregon data center, which is mostly, if not entirely, powered by renewable energy sources. Heroku runs on top of Amazon. I'm fine with Heroku. Amazon less so. Their information about their energy sources has been very limited. I understand that might be improving, but it's been slow. And also, I just don't think Amazon are a very ethical company. And there's been some news today about more of that kind of stuff. So anyway, not that Google's that much better, but Render is where I've currently landed around finding a pragmatic, but also at least a little bit ethical kind of approach. Of course, if you're dealing with massive apps, then neither Heroku nor Render are probably going to fit the bill. And that's fine. And you've probably got SRE people to help you with that. Anyway, Render recently released their API. And that I thought was pretty cool, but they didn't seem to have any native, like language native libraries to interact with the API. So I thought, hey, I can build one. Or rather, I can start building one. So the gem exists. It's called render_API. quite obvious. But I wanted to talk through just a few things in the code because I kind of like how I've structured it thus far. And maybe other people will find it useful or also maybe want to contribute. So I'm gonna kill the slides and switch to the code. And I'm gonna close the files that no longer exist because that was me running through some stuff that I might run through later. Okay, so we'll start with the README because that's a good place to start. You can see here, you can create a new client. Pretty simply, you've got to provide an API key, which maybe you'd store as an environment variable. And then the other thing that's worth noting is that, so this is the docs for Renders API. They have 5 different resources here: owners, services, deploys, custom domains, and jobs. And so what I've done is that I've namespaced all the specific endpoints for each resource within a method for that resource. So it's kind of clients within clients. And so we have a services one, you'll see here, we have a deploys one, and then you call the specific actions related to that resource. I've liked this approach because it avoids a situation where you might have a client that just has all the methods to interact with it on that client object. So you could have had like client.add service, client.edit service, client.delete service, and so forth, but for all the different resources and all the different actions. And it just, yeah, I find that a bit too chaotic. So I like this more focused approach. So we can see here that we've got like our deploys sub client, create, find, list, services, again, quite simple. And they all get defined through the client class. But they also have this shared object, the endpoint, and that's the part that actually does the HTTP requests. So has get, has post, as needed, I can add more. And that means that these sub clients remain quite focused and they don't get too concerned with the implementation of making the request or handling common things about the response. That can all be done by the endpoint. And one of those aspects is that I wrap every response in a response object. And particularly with arrays, I pass each object, it's returned as hash of arrays in JSON, and I put those into a data object. I considered having specific data objects for each resource, so having like a service class, having a deploy class, and having those with specific attributes as defined in the API currently. But I felt that tied this code too closely to this current version of the API. And that if Render decided to add more attributes, I didn't want to have to change my code. So instead, it's a very kind of dumbed down kind of, oh, sorry, that's not a good way of putting it. Very lo-fi approach, a wrapper around essentially a hash. It translates, they are camel case strings that return from the API, so I have to translate that to underscored approaches as method names, and then there's method missing to easily get those bits of data out. The other thing about these data objects is that there's no logic attached to them. So in Rails, you'd have a active record model instance, which you can call update or create or delete or destroy rather upon. And that's fine, but I like keeping the data separate from the logical actions. And so we have these clients for the logic and the data object just to hold the data. The tests are currently just using webmock, so they are quite simple. The examples are taken straight from the documentation of the API. I would like some live tests, maybe using something like VCR, but also we're dealing with a hosting service here. So if you do live stuff, that involves money. And I don't want to pay money to run my tests, I don't think, at least not at this point. But yeah, what I've found is that taking this approach makes adding support for the further endpoints quite easy. So now the question is, do I have time for some quick live coding to run through the example?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Oh, IDE. Sorry. Yes. Yes, it's Nova. I'm not entirely sold on it, but I'm sticking with it for the moment. Okay, code. Let's go. What I wanted to do as a quick example is that I don't have anything for this owner's resource, and I thought let's implement the list action for that. So we should start with a test. Owner's spec, and I'm going to make so many typos, I'm sure. And I'm just going to take what I've got in services for the moment and bring that across. So we're testing list here. This is for finding a single thing, which we're not going to do right now. So we're dealing with owners. There's typo number 1. And so this whole like namespaced like clients within clients approach, we're going to focus on client.owners. The endpoint is, let's copy and paste that. It's owners. And then the example of the data, this is what I've been copying and pasting, is that. All right. But it's not indented quite nicely. There we go. All right, and we want to say it returns the owner data. We're calling list with no arguments. We're not really fussed about pagination. Let's say the ID is me, just to give some character to this default data. We want to say first one has an ID of me. These are not the most rock solid of tests, but there's something. And so now we can say bundle exec spec features owners. And it doesn't know about this client owners method, which is fair because we haven't done anything. So in our client, we can add that in, def owners. Make sure we pass through the endpoint, acquire it, and we want to create the file. All right. It's nested within render API, clients, owners. But we want to inherit from base, which has some common logic here, and we want to make sure that this file knows about that. All right, we've got the endpoint there. Great, off we go. We can run the spec again. But it doesn't know the method list. That's right. Okay, so again, we'll just borrow from services. So list parameters is something defined in base, and that handles the limit, the cursor for pagination, those two filters, because those are common attributes to all the list endpoints. Thankfully, Render make that pretty clear in their docs. So we can just take that and use it, but we need to be talking to the right endpoint. And that might be all we need, which is great. Let's just see if Rubocop's happy. And it is not. Why is it not? Because I cut and paste the example payload. But this is JSON. This isn't Ruby. Ruby can understand it, but it thinks we're dealing with symbols here, and we actually want to be dealing with strings. So we're gonna change that to use the hash rocket syntax. Rubocop's probably happy now. Yep, and we'll run all the specs. Yep, okay. The one other thing I wanted to do was let's actually test it against Render's API itself, which is, in the long term, not the best way to actually test the code, but right now we want to check that it does actually work with the API. So render API client, I need an API key. Have this tab open just for this purpose. I'm going to create an API key, and then I'm going to revoke it as soon as this talk is done. Because I'm sure you're all great people, but I don't want you hosting all your code on my credit card. Thank you very much. And so now we can say client.owners.list. Great, that's given us a response. And we can say response first name. It's my name, that's good. My email address. And there's the ID that Render has assigned. So it's actually talking to their server, which is wonderful. So I'll hit done on this, and then I'll also hit revoke on this. Cool. All right. I think that's it. On the slides. Oh, keynote. Yeah, there's some code. If you want, it's open source, so you can go have a look at it. If you want to create a PR to add some more of those endpoints in, be my guest. I've thought about maybe adding RBS type support or sorbet, but I guess we'll see. This is at this point just something I wrote up over the last couple of days, but I've spoken for far too long. Unless anybody had some final questions, so I can bore you just a little bit more.
I think Dwight asked to share the repo on the Zoom chat.
Yeah, I'll share it in the Zoom chat and on Slack as well. I'll put the links for all the different code things in. All right. Yeah, I'll leave it there. People can hit me up on Slack or in the chat here if they've got more questions. But thanks everyone for listening.